Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to the organizers as well as the ORF for having me here. It's an absolute privilege to see a lot of you having great discussions on how think tanks need to function to be more relevant in today's times. I apologize, I wasn't here for a large part of the conversation this morning. I'm with the Institute of Defense Studies and Analyses. It's a think tank functioning under the aegis of the Ministry of Defense. And we've just had a new boss take over. So all of today was basically spent discussing with the new Director General on our research agendas and how we need to take them forward. It's interesting that for an institution like ours, one of the points that he stressed on was that we need to come up to the times of the digital age. And he said, as an institution, which is, obviously has a large overhang of how the government functions, we haven't been proactive and we haven't used multiple digital media platforms available to take sort of this conversation to both the policymaker as well as the larger public, considering we're part of the public discourse on Indian foreign and national security policy, considering we're a public service institution. So I felt rather good listening to him this morning. A lot of us are energized and we're raring to go. Hopefully that spirit continues after the initial enthusiasm. We're all, I'm sure we've had conversations today on, the role of think tanks, how we have to continuously work on being more relevant. But ORF does a fantastic job on the topic that we've got specialists together to speak on talking about incubating policy conversation into 80 characteristics. It's sort of a no-brainer in times like today, but for many institutions, and I say this from personal experience, there's still a lot of reluctance to embrace this. Sometimes they don't possess the expertise, sometimes it's plainly not on their priority or agenda. And I don't mean this in terms of broadcasting. There's plenty of broadcasting being done in terms of what we are doing. But in terms of engagement, seeing how our research is reaching the right target audiences, assessing its impact, influence, are things that are still a work in progress. A lot of times it's very individual-driven and not institution-driven. I often tease Samir Saran that, he speaks in sound bites. And I think it's actually a compliment because he, by leadership, and of course also through his institution, have been able to manage to incubate these policy conversations into 80 characteristics. And it's a niche, quite frankly, a lot of us would like to cultivate. So as we set up this conversation today, I thought it'd be useful to sort of throw back at, I was at the last iteration of this conference, and at that point of time, we were going through, the same, we had some of the similar debates come up saying that, we're still talking in times of a paradox where, there are research agendas, which are data sort of heavy, format driven, etc. But you're also, at the same time, you have to be quick and, be digital savvy. How are we doing this? But I feel in the last sort of year, we've seen an explosion of podcasts and live streaming and everyone sort of embracing this highly visual component of research dissemination. So the question that, came up to me in my mind, and I'd hope the speakers sort of work on that, is, have there been tangible experiences that we can share since the last time we met where these changes have happened, some positive examples, maybe perhaps that we can share and sort of take back home. Second, of course, there's a lot of noise, a lot of clutter, but are we part of conversations that matter? One of my former institution heads, I remember when we were planning sort of the outreach strategy, he said, how much engagement is good engagement? And I want to throw that to the both of you. Is it about the hits and number of retweets, or are we becoming echo chambers? How do we sort of keep the balance in a sense? Then, of course, the conversation of your target audience. I read somewhere that, from the policymaker target audience point of view, a think tank is supposed to, the communication strategy is supposed to take you from a policymaker not knowing anything about what you do to the journey where he's championing your research. So now that's sort of a broad spectrum to achieve, but that requires sort of content customization. And then you also have the not niche audience, which is the larger public discourse that you engage with. Are we thinking in these terms? Are we driving our agendas in those sort of areas? And finally, just to set this up for our speakers, how sustainable is it? I can speak from institutional experience that for a lot of times it's very individual driven. The organizational culture right now is not adapted to it, so you have the boss who drives the change, and then when he leaves or she leaves and the agenda is different, it's not institutionally continuing. So are we seeing organically changes within think tanks that are driving this conversation forward? Someone told me that the best, in 5 years from now, what you do in a monograph or a paper should actually be able to compress into a digital audio file. That's your PDF. And I was quite, despite being from the millennial generation, it kind of shocked me a little bit. But is that what we are looking at? Are those conversations relevant now, or are they still far away? So I'm going to leave that open to tackle from our speakers. I'll invite comments from all of you, of course, once they are done. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to both of our speakers today. We have Mr. Apar Gupta, who's the Executive Director from the Internet Freedom Foundation. And we also have Dr. Shanthie D'Souza, who's the founder and president of Mantraya, which is an independent forum that seeks to make constructive contributions in the field of strategy and innovation. I'll ask you to go first.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to ORF and the University of Pennsylvania. A little about what the Internet Freedom Foundation does. We are not exactly a think tank. We are an advocacy group. We work on human rights in technology and hope to bring forward research which we use for other institutions towards actionable change. So we engage with policymakers, regulatory consultations, we engage with parliamentarians, and we approach courts. We are somewhat like the ACLU, but we are different. So some of my remarks here may be off color. They may not be suited to think tanks per se, which may be prioritizing more of research, longer-term goals in terms of prioritizing their values. And that's a very heavy caveat I just want to put. The second one is that I've just stepped into this role after 10 years of litigation, so if my views do come across strong, please excuse my past as a lawyer. So how did we start on this journey at Internet Freedom Foundation is also a tangible example of how we engaged on digital media for a policy outcome, utilizing research which did exist. So a lot of people in India are aware of the Save the Internet movement due to a video which was made by a comedy group explaining it in 5 to 6 minutes. But what happened before that? Prior to that, there were about 6 experts who sat down and condensed the academic literature on network neutrality as it existed abroad. We borrowed heavily from not only the papers of Timothy Wu, but Barbara Van Schewick, who was at the University of Stanford. We came up with regulatory filings. We look at the MCA records, and we make a complete academic paper to a certain extent, but it is not peer-reviewed. It doesn't have any kind of external oversight. Then we reduce it, simplify it, and build a public campaigning platform, which is used by people to send emails to India's telecom regulator to take a certain view in the public interest. And by itself, there's a critique which develops for this model. One of the best articulations of this was by the former minister, I think, of Home at that time, Mr. P. Chidambaram, in a column in the India Express, where he said slogans can't be regulatory principles. And I think there was some credibility to that critique as well. However, as we've seen time go by, some of those suggestions have been adopted by the telecom regulator, even though that, and what people say, shrill voices has died down. So there is some benefit in engaging with online communities. And I would say that the change which is happening over the past year will keep on continuing. And in fact, the medium will keep changing. And the medium will then impact the messaging and the structuring and eventually the research priorities. This is a good thing. This is a bad thing. And there are upsides and downsides, and that's there with a lot of things. And I'll just indicate what are some broad benefits as well as concerns which come through here. The first one is that the research priorities which are set quite often, in my view and from my experience dealing with in the internet policy sector in India, are set essentially by funding priorities. And if I'm saying something which is which may be only limited to this domain, please excuse that. But to a large extent, because and I thought I got hints of that in the past panel, is that the funding priorities are also determining how your research direction can be set over a certain period of time. And if you don't have a greater amount of term planning, over longer term planning by itself, these priorities will be set to a large degree by external funders rather than by what may be an actual need. And communication and engagement by itself across digital communities, across platforms, does one thing. It opens you up to a very real, immediate need of research, which sometimes may not be tackled because it's contentious, or it wades into a research policy area which may not see a lot of interest from an external funder. Especially in the rights sector, this is sometimes visible, and we've seen that. The second one is it helps civic education and engagement, and that's the eventual outcome from research which you also want. You want a large number of supporters who are there. You don't want the mob, but you do want an engaged citizenry who can also contribute in some element to a very threshold, a starting threshold of peer review. And the third is it helps you grow capacity and spur scholarship as well. I think it brings in more people, young people. It helps set up more think tanks. And towards the last end, I'll just give you one more example. We set up a online campaign called keepusonline.in, and we reached out to 3 research institutions, and one of them had just started researching on internet shutdowns. What are internet shutdowns? Internet shutdowns is when the complete access to the internet is turned off by the government, and India is #1 there, which is a very shameful statistic for a democratic country. And what we wanted was a certain norm be based, certain studies be done, the risks be identified, what can be the legal mechanism for it, and also to come up with the data, because there was a lack of transparency and a legal mechanism, so we didn't even know what was the level of the legal of the internet shutdowns occurring in India. We did this in 2017, and thereafter there has been a large amount of scholarship which has developed. There have been economic studies which have been done. Think tanks are now devoting a large amount of time and space to internet shutdowns, because it's impacting not only rights, which are much more towards human rights, but even economic rights, impacting businesses. And as digitization becomes a much broader goal, even in service delivery for government, it harms even delivery of subsidies and rations. Now, quickly, what are the risks? They tie in with the benefits. The risks are, firstly, the slogans itself take over, and the mob takes over this entire thing, and your research priorities are thrown out of the window. The second is the lack of a peer review system as it already exists in India, and I know this from the legal academy. Journals publish for 2 years, the third year they're discontinued, because it's again individual based, and again the institutes themselves and the research institutions, where they may be private colleges, there may be academies, just don't have the people. They sometimes lack the competence, they sometimes lack the faculty, they sometimes lack the support. And this is not to blame them. This is just to indicate a fault. And when there is a fragile system of peer review, again, a PDF may become a study, okay? And finally, what's the problem is that the capacity for sustained, more patient research may get obscured by much more immediate outcomes towards visibility, retweets, Facebook shares, Instagram likes, okay? And that is a problem. Now, there are opportunities and there are risks, and I'll stop here, and I'll look towards hearing and learning more from people across the table.
Thank you, Apar. The risks and the opportunities. Shanthie, I'll let you take over from there.
Thank you, Shruti. I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity, but I'd like to start with 3 caveats. I'm actually stepping in for somebody else, so I'm not Dr. Annapurna speaking right now, but yeah, given my experience with Mantraya, and second caveat is also about the digital challenge I face in Goa. So I think it's very appropriate to speak about digital area and how to use think tanks in the digital area. And the third is I'm the last speaker, so I really don't want to be very long and keep you away from the concluding session. So having said that, brevity is the key, okay? And so Twitter, from 140 characters, got down to 280. And this was a delight for many grammar purists, because you had words being said like, instead of great, you had GR8 and all of that. But now, with more characters, you can say a lot more, despite the fact that brevity is the essence. And the second aspect is also about accessibility. So what we see today is think tanks are able to make some kind of an impact and outreach through social media, which has revolutionized the way Indian think tanks have worked. We are still in a very traditional mode in many ways, the way we do research. But when it comes to using social media, I think the Indian think tanks are getting very proactive, which is good, because basically the function of a think tank is to inform the public debate. And think tankers in India and researchers have done it through newspaper articles, journal articles, books, and stuff like that. But the point is that who reads? Who has the time to read? And be it policymaker or a layman, no one really reads. No one really reads newspapers as well. So in that way, I think this whole idea of using social media has been very useful. And it has opened the debate to a larger audience. And that is a very important point for us, because most of the things happen in Delhi. So even when Samir was talking today, he was talking of New Delhi consensus, not really of Indian consensus. So there are a lot of voices in the rest of India which are not really represented. And those voices are heard today thanks to platforms like Twitter or Facebook. And you have a debate going on many issues. The second aspect is we really don't know how decisions are made in this country, be it foreign policy or any other critical matters. So in a way, today we see policymakers taking on to Twitter and talking about things, in which way there is some kind of transparency and accountability developing, whereby you do have a policymaker making statements and responding to queries, which is a new form of interaction and a new form of conversation. And this is something which is definitely useful for this country in terms of a policy debate. Now, if you look at what it has done to the research in this country, I think it has made it more responsible. So you just can't put up things out there which you're not sure of. So you have to be credible. So when you're debating on the role of think tanks, of maintaining a neutral space, you're also talking about credibility. And we did have this discussion in the morning. So when you're talking about credibility, you're also being able to say a lot of things which were said in so many words, in few words, and making that impact which is required, both at the local level and at the national level, and to the larger global audience as well. So something happening in a small town from where I come, like Goa, can reach a larger audience today. For instance, the research forum we are heading at the moment has a lot of e-interns, and this is how we are trying to reach out to the young audience. It's not physically possible for many of these students to come and work in places where they want to. But the role of mentoring, the role of reaching out to them can be done through something like this e-internship programs, which we are running. So there is a way to reaching out to the larger, younger population, not in Delhi, but rest of India again. And despite the fact that you have a lot of foreign return students coming and joining think tanks, I think there's a lot of talent in this country which has not been really used and explored and developed. So I think by using social media and the digital platforms, we are able to tap onto this talent in ways which was not physically possible otherwise. So having said that, we also need to look of how these conversations, which at times do get trivialized, you do have trolls, you do have fake news, and you have this challenge of counter-narratives which are always being thrown up. How do you put up the research, your research, in face of that? And that is a challenge which remains. The second challenge is also about the polarization which is occurring, which at times even leads to radicalization. So what kind of engagement strategies do we look at as think tanks? Now, to come to specific points of remaining relevant as think tanks, I think the most fundamental aspect is the rigor of research, which I'm sad to say, is missing at times in this country. We don't do good field research. We don't collect primary data, which is required. And there are many issues associated with that. It's just not because we can't get to the field. It's also about funding, about organizing your research and doing stuff. And also the fact that because of the lack of the rigor in research, we are not able to disseminate information which is required. And thereby the whole idea of having innovation in research is missing. And that plays in the digital area because the gap will widen. There are no alternative narratives. The innovation aspect remains missing. So there will be a digital gap in terms of how you put out your information, what kind of research you do, how relevant is your research. The third aspect is about accessibility to the larger public, which is the fundamental job of a think tank. And therein, I think Indian think tanks need to do more. For instance, we did have summits before, but we really don't have a web platform where all the think tanks in India can put out the research in one place and could be accessible to a larger audience, not just in India, but also abroad. The fourth point is also about accountability, and that's related to funding. But given the fact that when you put out your research on the digital platforms, you have to be credible, and you've got to maintain that public trust. Now, if you're looking specifically of how to reach to the younger audience, I think we need a lesson in strategic communication of how to tag in relevant information that draws the young crowd. We heard this morning that people go to universities and they don't know what think tanks are, what think tank does, and how do you join a think tank. So I think there's a gap which has not been filled in, not by universities and not by think tank. And this, I think the social media platform would be very useful to do that. And lastly, how can we make ourselves relevant to policymakers who are today using Twitter for everything they want to say? The President of the United States hires and fires and does all policy on Twitter. So we have to step in and do things there, because that's where the bridge of the civil society and the governments and the think tanks exist. And that's a space that needs to be developed and built. So these are just a few points which I raised, and I hope we'll have a good conversation and more points from you, if the question's any. Thank you.
Dr. Megan, do you want to weigh in a bit?
Know by now. How do you, in terms of credibility and accessibility, and how do you make that happen? What's the measure when you're doing it right? How do you know that? And in terms of the sort of expanded Twitter form, in terms of how do you, the challenge and the pushback I get in these meetings is how can you possibly expect us to reduce what we do to a tweet? And is there any utility in that? And isn't that a reductionist approach that can only undermines the great work that we're producing and the credibility and integrity of think tanks? So, I think that's for both of you. I think it's very instructive in terms of, and I would point out that from the advocacy side, in terms of looking at, what, and your presentation was instructive in terms of especially the engagement on social media and what that means for think tanks. And the fact that even though, you started by saying I'm not a think tank, I'm an advocacy group. Well, the lines, as I sort of said this morning, are increasingly blurred, but I think the real value of the blurring is for think tanks that are on the other end, understanding your message in terms of the value of tapping into social media, not necessarily succumbing to it, but seeing what's going on out there. I created this year, or last year, an open source on the rankings. And, immediately people said, you do that, what are those people aren't going to know anything. And I look at it, and it's an interesting feedback loop. In terms of there are different voices, identifying new and different think tanks, and they have interesting things to say. And from my standpoint, some of them I will include in the next round in terms of because the views that they have expressed are very solid and very credible in terms of what they're saying. So I think in all of this, we have to be open to sort of seeing, as your presentation, what are the pluses and minuses of this, and incorporating those things that enhance what we do, and not necessarily succumbing to the things that, are problematic.
Right. Thank you very much for that. I think I'm going to, Shanthie and Apar, I'll throw this back to you. But I thought this, the morning I said, I'm sorry I wasn't here in the morning when you were having these conversations, but it's instructive for me. When we were having the conversation with our new Director General, one of the people turned up and said, we're a research think tank, we do work with rigor, we invested in field trips, we produce books, this, that, and the other. And so, while our work should speak for ourselves, and we shouldn't be pushing it forward. And I thought what he said was very instructive. He said, please get out of your ivory towers. The times have changed. You need to, you're producing work, good work speaks for itself, but unless you're part of the conversation, there's no value to the work you're bringing to the table. So I think that's instructive in the way that organization cultures have to tune into the times that we are in. But just adding to your point, in my opening sort of comments, how much engagement is good engagement? That's exactly what Dr. Meghant was coming to. And when you say the risks tied to the, with the benefits and so on and so forth, we don't want the mob, but we can get engaged with the citizenry. Where does one draw that line? And to you, when we're saying that, it's kudos to you for doing what you're doing with your think tank, but a lot of times this focus, which requires this sort of customization of your research to reach proper target audiences, do you think we in India have woken up to it and are actually putting those resources, channeling those resources for that customization to happen?
Well, I think very important and interesting questions. It's not really easy to measure credibility, in the way research is being done. But the very fact that you put your research out on the internet platform and then you do have responses to that. So you can't put up anything which is like lifted from somewhere, or there's a lot of plagiarism going on here, or you have copied someone's research, or you've just created or fabricated a research product. So in that way, there's some kind of checks. So I think that itself is a measure of credibility in many ways. Secondly, is also the fact that if there is someone listening, which leads to your question on customization and the audience, the target you're trying to reach, if there is some kind of feedback, which mostly comes in through the internet or through the social media platform, that, we are interested in knowing more, can you come and give us a briefing, be it government, or be it some non-governmental organization, or work in Afghanistan. Yeah, that gives you some kind of measure that, yeah, you've put out a product out there which makes some relevance, or make some difference to people on the ground, or even at the governments. So that is the way I think we could measure impact, because we don't really have those kind of metrics and data collating systems of knowing how useful our research is. We, as an organization, try to identify gaps and address those gaps in research. So we don't do foreign policy for the sake of doing foreign policy. India's relations with this country and that country, post-visit, pre-visit. But look at those gaps in areas where actually things have not been addressed, and how could we address them? So we'll try to take a very constructive position. So at least it engages the audience at various levels. So it could be very broad-based, or it could be very specialized. Now with the interns at the organization, we try to get them into specialized mode of working. Because what happens is when you reach a particular level in India, like where I am, I work on Afghanistan, but I can speak on digital economy, I can speak on anything under the sun, and get away with it. But that's not what we really require. What we really require at this point of time is to have that specialized knowledge, which is missing. So even in area studies, we have very few scholars. There's so much of conversation about Pakistan and China. I mean, how do you name who are the scholars in this country who really work on this, who really know the language? So we have not built that core expertise. And without building that core expertise, you don't make any useful contributions to anybody, be it the society or the government. I think that's the gap we're trying to fill. So when you do this customization and try to look at a target audience, you're also looking at the younger crowd. And that is of more interest to us. Because you have some responsibility of mentoring as well, because that's why I came back from Singapore and I came back to India. And I feel that that's a way of giving back. And that, I think, is missing in many think tanks in India. Universities do teach, but they don't teach stuff which is useful to students. So when they're out in the job market, they are totally irrelevant. So I think we need to look at issues right from the bottom up of how to build that base, that critical mass we have been talking about, and make think tanks relevant, just not to the governments, but to the younger people who are the future. And the second thing is about accessibility. The fact that you are there on the internet platforms, anyone can write to you, is so much more easier than those days when we couldn't reach out to a larger audience. And that feedback itself is very useful, just in terms of your growth, organizational growth. The pushback occurs, but we are trying to work on this. It's a way of experimentation, and it's an innovative way of looking at things and doing things differently. So I'll stop there and take it later. Thanks.
Yeah. There are no easy answers, and I don't think so I have them. What I have is a certain amount of experience based on how we've engaged with the regulatory consultations and tried to use research and put it out there. And people have complained because they want a email template to send to the telecom regulator in the present consultation, which ends today, on over-the-top services. So they're saying, why don't you build a platform like Save the Internet so we can just copy an email and send? But we are not doing that this time. We're making them do the hard work. So what do? When the consultation paper comes out, we make a 4-page summary. We say, you just need to read these 4 pages. They still don't read it. Then we come up with a presumptive view before making our final submissions, and we hyperlink that. Of course, we push it on different platforms. And let's remember, Twitter is very small in India. It's in fact in the App Store classified for being in the top 10 services as a news service, not an internet platform. There are bigger platforms than Twitter in India, such as ShareChat, and it's in Indic languages. There is...
What are the 4 that you're pushing?
Yeah.
4 platforms.
So the platforms that we are using right now, essentially we try to drive traffic towards email and our email lists, and then bring longer conversation with people on our email lists. We try to engage with people, and if they seem to be credible, we try to involve them as volunteers. We ask them to send them their resume, a statement of interest. We do a call with them, so it's fairly structured. Then we bring them into a Slack group. Then we onboard them into a WhatsApp group and form groups of 4 or 5 people. Because we are looking for diverse skills. You're just not looking for lawyers to talk on policy without understanding the product. You're just not looking for people who are coming from a human rights background, tilting the conversation towards a certain end without understanding how products are developing inside companies by itself, especially in technology companies. You want the product at the very start to respect human rights. And so we put out a presumptive analysis, and then we put out an economic analysis as well, which was done by a volunteer, who mapped the earning reports of all Indian major telecom companies over 2 years, their growths, their revenues, their peaks and hits, and we are today making that submission. We did it on Reddit. We got massive engagement there. We pushed it out on Twitter again and again, but there are engagement strategies you need to concentrate. I'll just quickly step to the question, how much is enough? I think it's enough to the extent where it doesn't distract you from your core organizational objective. And if it's research, do that research. Our objective is towards looking at the research as it exists, how compatible is it with our understanding of the Indian Constitution and our fundamental rights within technology, and then bringing it towards actionable change. So we have one platform right now which is running a privacy campaign. It's called saveourprivacy.in. And here we have drafted an entire model law working with some of the best young lawyers in India. Multiple Rhodes Scholars, multiple Harvard, Oxford kind of gentrified kind of lawyers, And they've drawn up a 90-section law, but it's not set in stone. It has a comment feature. So like a Google Doc, anyone in the public can go highlight a portion and put their comment in. Some people have even indicated grammar errors, so we are kind of thankful to that. Okay, we are not that good. Then we crystallize that into 7 principles because everyone won't read the legal text. And we invite feedback on the 7 principles as well. And there are volunteers who come in, and we just put out a call on Twitter, and they translate that at least into 8 Indian languages because you want to reach out to a larger crowd. And there are constant updates and blog posts. So we segregate media mentions, and we segregate any kind of blog posts which we do, which is an ongoing analysis because privacy is a developing story as well. You need to keep analyzing it. You need to keep doing it with rigor. Again, legal analysis. But in our explainers, we now rely on video explainers where we look towards media partnerships where we do specific videos, one on surveillance, one on data localization, and we get the expert in the room, and we make them sit down, and we make it easier for them. At the same point of time, we rely on people who have large YouTube followings, who have a large following, but they need the content. They need to talk about these things in a much more accessible way. And last time we reached out to certain people who spoke to a much more elite urban crowd, so we got our videos this year done in Hindi. And we are going to reach out and do it in more Indian languages and continue doing that. So this is the kind of engagement which helps. Numbers help because that brings a democratic legitimacy to your demand to a policymaker. But at the same point of time, I think that engagement can overwhelm. So you need to moderate it. And secondly, if somebody is interested, you need to onboard them. You need to be much more adaptable and just not look at communication as talking to a person, but also if they're listening and they want to volunteer. And a lot of people right now, in our experience, want to volunteer in certain roles. You should have a capacity component within your communications for that. It brings in a lot of great people with different perspectives, especially engineers. And I'm sorry, I'm talking from my perspective as a lawyer. I really enjoy when an engineer steps into the conversation and tells me I've got it completely wrong.
Right, thanks so much, Apar. I think we'll open this conversation up. So far, we've had this conversation on how much engagement is good engagement, but I think the essence of what we've all really spoken about is let's think about championing content, make it relevant, make it credible. Let's not overemphasize the tools. Let's adapt. Let's identify influencers. I think that's a very valid point that he brought in, that a lot of times we have all this information, we don't think about how to disseminate it, and I think that's a point well made. And of course, then analyze this dissemination. Now I open this up at a lot of people heading think tanks here. I'd request all of you to sort of share your experiences on how you've adapted your organizations to the digital age and what you think we need to push forth. I'll start, of course, Harsh wanted to come in and make a point first. I'll start with him, then I welcome your feedback.
Well, I think, the initial remarks that both Shanthie and Apar made point to a fundamental sort of paradox, because I think what is happening is, at least to me, it seems that ultimately content will matter or should matter. So research, good research, credible research will in the end restore or give credibility to whichever organization or whichever individual is sort of trying to disseminate that information. And here we have a problem in terms of, I think, a lot of the things that we had discussed earlier as to how do you create that ecosystem where you sort of funnel in that level of, that respect for doing some fundamental basic research. Which again seems to be a major deficit. But I think the problem here is, especially in today's environment and in this context of 280 characters, is that, look, some of our biggest stars today are those who exist in Twitter sphere. They get media time, they get newspaper, they make newspaper headlines, they are 24/7 there, you are bombarded with their images. And to tell a youngster go and, immerse yourself in one culture, spend 1 year in Indonesia, spend 1 year in Afghanistan, or do an anthropological study in an Indian village. I mean, how are you going to convey? The incentive structure is changing so rapidly that he or she looks at the role models. Why do I have to do this research? I will be a star by tweeting out some nonsense every day. Somehow that will at least give me that platform. So I think that contradiction in that sense of how do you convince a youngster that, look, this is something of value, not simply to you, but what you're doing is going to make an impact in a larger sort of social, political sense. And I think that's, that is a challenge as someone who's also involved in recruiting people for an organization like ORF, who is involved in mentoring people in terms of how you take your career forward. I find it extremely problematic because the imagery around you is such, the environment is changing so rapidly, and especially when you grapple with this issue of what do I do with my research, and how do I, why is it important for me to do fundamental basic research when I'm a master's student? I can very well write a few op-eds and tweet them out and become a star. I think this is a particularly, I think, Indian situation that we have dealt with in the past as well, that our op-ed columnists get more time even in the think tank circuit, even abroad, than our researchers. So I think while the issue that Shanthie raises is very valid, we don't have good researchers, especially in social sciences. We are not training them well. But I think the incentive structure is such. I mean, you can literally name people who are our stars in the international conference circuit. And these are the people who have never done fundamental research. These are the people who write op-eds. These are the people who appear on televisions and provide knowledge to the world. So I think that incentive structure, unless you change that, because there is a historical legacy issue here. And now with the Twitter coming into the sphere, we have sort of, this problem is getting aggravated. That everyone views himself or herself as a specialist, right? So we as Shanthie said, we can talk about everything and anything. And especially in the Twitter world, where you are commenting on everything some things you know about, some things you don't know about, most of the things you don't know about, but you are so obligated to comment upon it because that's how you make your presence felt in a world which seemingly is becoming more and more disconnected. So the challenge, I think, for organizations, for individuals who are in this, in this role of mentoring others, or who look at this problem from a longer-term perspective, is how do you do that? And I think, therefore, I'm quite impressed by Shanthie and what she's trying to do from Goa, because I think I'm having this difficulty living here in Delhi, where kids come to you and they walk away. They say, why is this important? I'll tweet out something, I'll write a few columns, and I'm a star already. Why should I bother about working on a long research project? What will that give to me? So I think the incentive structure is changing, and we need to adapt at some level. But I'm not so sure that, and I think I'm relatively young, but I still am unsure in terms of how I adapt to this, because it seems to be changing so rapidly. So I would really, Apar, because he's working on this, I would really like to hear from you as to what has your experience been in terms of reaching out to these youngsters and making a case that, look, this is important, think about it in the long term, because it's easier said than done. I don't think I can take a history or a political science grad and tell him or her that, look, this is important for the long term. He'll say, what about my, the present is more important. I need to really make something out of my life. So I think that, and especially in the Indian context, where universities are not really putting focus on research. So universities are not really gearing our ecosystem in a direction where we can really make something out of these kids. So, and this is a point that we discussed earlier as well, when I think Ambassador Deo also pointed out that it's a real challenge for us in terms of recruitment, in terms of getting people interested in what we are doing. So while there is some communication problem as well from our side, from the think tanker world, in terms of telling students that there is there is something here for you as well, but I think largely the structural issue to me seems to be more important. That the structure of our environment is changed in directions which does not privilege or incentivize research, or especially long-form research. And the problem that it generates for us is that if you do not have credible credible research coming out of our think tanks, then the credibility will very soon fall. Because if not today, then somewhere down the line, we will realize that what we have done is basically written op-eds. And that is something that I think think tanks should really avoid.
Thank you, Harsh. You almost sounded wounded, but I completely agree. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Let me make things very clear here. Like, you know, you can't escape the digital highway. Internet, when it came, there were people who were saying, we don't have electricity, how do we have internet? And in Delhi, in workshops here, some years back, almost a decade back, some very senior fellow says, we don't have electricity in India. How will internet work? And you are trying to put bullock cart on this path. Friends, let me remind you, you should live in changing times, exciting times, and very upcoming revolutionary times. The whole question of digitalization is like a highway. And if you are not on that highway, you are left behind. Let us face the facts. And what Apar was saying, what a friend was saying from Goa, they're all putting things in the right perspective. The whole idea is how to we spread the outreach. How, as a think tank, we should get really adapted to building a platform of digitalization, making a broader communication strategy, and trying to outreach to the maximum, whether it is Goa or Patna, or it is Shillong, or it is Delhi. One highway I know connects all its digital world. And the mediums may be different, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat, or any, you can say, it keeps on innovating itself, you know. Orkut is out of place now. So it keeps on innovating. So idea is to get on the highway, get on the right track, and use it to maximization of your good work, which a think tank or a think tank group is doing. In what way? I don't think advocacy is anyway out of the league of the think tanks, as you rightly started, and I am not a think tank. No, you are very much a think tank. And what people have to realize that we are sitting in an age which is completely changing. On your mobile, you book your ticket. You're sitting here, book a ticket for Mexico. You book a ticket for Patna. You book your reservations in Spain. You book your... The credibility issue, of course, whether you get cheated or not cheated, then that all those questions. But 99% it works. And question is how we are going to use this platform for dissemination of our research practices and work, and how do we outreach the poor farmer who is suffering, the suicides which are taking place. We are not addressing those issues. We think these are very modern issues on Twitter and all as a fad. It's not a fad. We have to convert into something, a social objective also, and use the power of that Twitter or the Facebook or the YouTube as a social medium of engine. That's the point I'm trying to make. Thank you so much.
I appreciate your time. Thank you. Dr. Sambandhan, why don't you step in?
Shruti, thank you for this thing. Whilst we talk about the role of Twitter specifically, we should also not forget the role of the traditional medium and where Twitter really plays a role. Twitter and Twitter especially plays a good role in mobilization for a specific, say, Arab Spring or whatever. If there is immediacy, and immediacy needs to happen, there is a convergence, there is specificity, there is cause, there is need to mobilize. Twitter is fantastic. But we as Shruti's organization, as all organizations, we do thought out research which cannot be collapsed into a slogan. This morning also we talked about content and message. A message may be fantastic, but if there is no content in the message, they're just words. So we should be very careful whilst we use or call for the use of platforms like Twitter. For what? Is it to, okay, suppose Jim is organizing an event, he wants to enlarge the audience, then Twitter is fantastic. But if Jim wants to say, talk about his next book in detail, provide a summary, provide an abstract, provide content, provide everything, Twitter would lead the viewer to a link which gives it in detail. So we need to calibrate our use of such technology. And as Noam Chomsky would always say, the 4 pillars still hold true. Where do we go for credibility? We go to the mainstream medium. Where do we go for in-depth analysis? We again go to the mainstream medium, be it print bias, but print or television or whichever. But we do, we're also in the era of sound bites. We want quick quotes. So for that, Twitter could be a prod. So perhaps we should do that to make Twitter an entry point into a larger findings that we all are working on. Thank you. It's more of an intervention and a suggestion.
It's about the experience with your organization. How do you know, Gateway does a great job of sending us and being very relevant with their research.
I don't know how to. Okay, well, thank you. I'm very happy to hear that. I can't claim any credit for it. I have no clue to how all these platforms work. But I do want to say one or two things. You know, I think there is, of course, there is merit in doing your work and doing the background and doing deep research and living in, you know, places for 5 years, etc. There are also lots of downsides to that. I mean, look at all the, there's been a lot of writing now about China specialists in the United States who have actually amended what they write and what they write about because they're so concerned about getting the visas and this, that, and the other. So just doing deep research, etc. I mean, I think we should, if we are actually trying for nuance now, then let's do nuance. New York Times, you know, the newspaper of record or whatever it calls itself. Now, obviously, the President of the United States attacks it. It's been great for the New York Times. Their circulation is higher than it's ever been. But on the other hand, it has correspondents like Tom Friedman, who a year ago interviewed, you know, MBS and came out and said, you know, what a fantastic guy he is. He's going to change Saudi Arabia. He's going to change the world. And he did make some changes. You know, women are allowed to drive, even if they still have guardians. But so I'm just trying to say, I think we have to challenge the credibility of everything, if we are getting to that. Not the Hindu, but still Sam. I mean, I read it myself when I want to. The same, but there are lots of people who have questions on that. You know, it eventually influences younger people more when, what was her name, Miley Cyrus said, go out and vote, than all your other mediums, New York Times, Twitter, whoever, whatever it was. So, you know, I think we need to recognize some realities, however awful they are. And that, you know, one of those realities is that we value, you know, deep research. But you have to ask then, who else does? You know, governments are operating on Twitter. And President, you know, Trump is not the only villain in this business. So if policy is not only announced, but certainly in many cases gets made that way, after a Twitter feed has been done, then government scrambles to make policy, to make it fit that thing. I think we should be looking at where democracies have got to. What has happened to democratic institutions that governments can get away with this, that politicians will get re-elected on this basis. So, I mean, as I said, I don't understand the world you're talking about, but I find it very troubling to try and fall back on old verities, which are no longer true, which do not apply.
Thank you very much.
I think it's been a very interesting debate since Shruti asked for some experiences to be shared. I thought I'll tell you about the Chennai Center for China Studies, which I'm running. We have in the last 3 years about 45 interns who have gone through us. And a lot of them have gone off for PhD or Australia or China, wherever. And we find that that is a great strength because they come there to learn and you can channelize their effort. And we made some of them in charge of the outreach programs and they excelled well because they want to prove that they are doing well. So that's one experiment which yielded good results for us. But yet the basic question remains about the quality of rigorous research and the balance that you try to achieve by Twittering or Instagramming or whatever. But that's inescapable. The point is that's inescapable if you have to reach out and to tell people what you are doing as a think tank. You might have excellent policy papers, well-researched, including field. I sent a team to Brahmaputra for carrying out a field study of the impact of Chinese dams, etc. Nobody reads it, let me tell you. So they're only interested in seeing that, yes, these guys have gone to Brahmaputra and come back. Maybe they'll look at some of the photographs. One of the researchers lost his mobile. That's perhaps more important to them than the statistics generated by the...
I just have to interrupt this. Exactly right. But what they do read is when Brahmachalani tweets on that same issue.
Yes. So, I think so. It's inescapable. Whether you call it a social level or inescapable thing for a think tank, we have no choice. So let's use the media that's available and, use it intelligently. And don't give up compromise on your basic requirement for carrying out fundamental, rigorous research.
Hi, thank you very much. In fact, Dr. Samandar, I just wanted to make a point. I agree with the larger conversation you're trying to make, but like Ambassador Deo mentioned, you see, within our peer groups now, as soon as news breaks, there's almost unspoken sort of pressure on you to have 5 talking points ready on your Twitter handle about the topic if you have remotely worked on the issue because you want to stay relevant to that conversation. And then the moment you sort of, you link your piece to it, and then, it's projection of what you have done in terms of research. So it adds value not just to you as a researcher, but also to your organization. And I think that's been incentivized. I'm sure ORF leads by example in many cases like that. In IDSA, it's been, finally, it's been incentivized that if you go and, research gets picked up and so on and so forth. The other thing you were talking about, it struck me. I have just finished a field trip to Arunachal Pradesh. It was on border perceptions. One of the feedbacks I sort of, after talking to these youngsters I got, and they said, ma'am, you have to mainstream, blah, blah, blah. And then they say, for example, why isn't Salman Khan our brand ambassador? It should be, we have a huge megastar here who's the king of Bollywood, mass sort of appeal. He should be the brand ambassador for the state and not someone else. And I believe you not, I put that, very reluctantly that down in my task force sort of recommendations, and that's one of the first things that got picked up. I mean, so because the gentleman has that kind of mass appeal, I mean, it doesn't speak very much of the rest of my recommendations, but I was sort of shocked at, what found traction or not. This is not to trivialize this conversation, but like everyone's been saying that, it's inescapable and we need to engage with it. I'll throw it back to Shanthie and then Apar for some of the comments that you got from the floor.
Well, I think we have actually created a culture of stardom, which is not really in sync with reality. So it depends on which stars are we looking at. And I think the problem is huge in Delhi. So you have this young scholars, as Harsh pointed out, who want to tweet and achieve instant stardom, right? And we do have scholars back in rest of India, back in Goa, who want to do field research and want to learn. Why? Because you lead by example. If I can go to Afghanistan and work and put out my products and they want to do work like that, they come back to me. So why don't we change that culture slowly but surely? That is one. So that brings back to the fundamental question of doing research. And the rigor of research should not be undermined by just facts like you can put out things on Twitter and become a star instantly. And it's true, Harsh, that most of the people who write op-eds get more attention in Delhi, and that's the reason I moved out of Delhi, because I was only doing op-eds. But now it's time to write books, and then again the question is who reads books? But that's not the fact. The fact is that if you can condense your book into one sentence, which you should be, without any problem, and as you said, pardon me? Any kind of books, but books. I'm talking about the length, the content and the messaging and how do you put it out there. I mean, you have to link your work to the Twitter or to the social media platforms because it gives you a larger audience. And people get interested and do start reading. I think you get a more following and feedback from the work you do. So you might have stars here, but the rest of India has workers, and we need to work on that. And that's a gap I think Delhi has to bridge, of getting those people here and getting them to work on field projects and getting that inputs out. So, yeah, sure.
I'm a bit disconcerted by this conversation, where people who should actually be saying that we should be researching are saying, who reads books? I mean, that's it. Yeah, it should. Maybe it's a reality, but I think we are not in the business of as think tanks. The product that we create, we use a certain medium to propagate it. But at the end of the day, think tanks are in the business of doing research. I find it extraordinary that people will say, why to do research, or why to, who writes books and who reads books? I mean, even a small paper or a occasional paper that we call is 10,000 words, it's a small monograph. That's also a book. Now, if the question that we are posing, the problem that we are trying to investigate demands that we write a long-form piece, then I think we cannot really be in the business of saying, why should we do it in 10,000 words? Let's do it at 1,000-word op-ed and publish it in a newspaper that will give us more traction. Or more still, let's get it down to 280 words and tweet it out. I think, at the end of the day, are we or are we not in the business of doing research? So let's first decide as think tankers. Yeah. And then we can perhaps move from there and have these broader discussions. Because if we are not in the business of doing research, then I think we are having a wrong conversation.
I being the sort of person who sort of says that, and have been attacked for, as a, university scholar suggesting that we need to rethink our approach to it, I think the reality is, and I think hopefully to quell your concern about this, is the fact that there isn't and should not be a fundamental change in terms of the mission of think tanks. And the mission of think tanks is to conduct research and analysis. That will endure. What must change, what has to change, and what I think people are saying and echoing is what products you produce, and maybe it's not books. And I don't think that communicating research necessarily has to be in a book. People have pointed out to me, you've written 15 books. Why are you telling us not to write books? Or why are you even challenging that? I think it has to be challenged, because the reality is that books in a printed form and journals in a printed form may not be what people will consume, including people that are going to make decisions. And so it's not that you will stop producing books or stop writing journal articles, but that you must think about other means, other products, other ways of reaching key public policymakers and the public itself that we have not thought about, and as a group we need to think about, because it's happening whether we like it or not. And then the third dimension, which must change, is the perception of audiences and how we reach them, and understanding what is strategic communications, what are audiences, and how do we engage them, and the policymakers may not be the primary and exclusive audience as they were historically. And these are all things where the reality of that is it's not just think tanks. Universities are rethinking tenure. They've asked me, come to me and sort of said, the traditional notion of publishing a book and journal as the primary basis for tenure, we're reevaluating it. And it's not, online universities, it's major Ivy League universities that are sort of saying, not that we're going to stop thinking about what your publication record is, but how else are you engaging? Additionally, the whole notion of peer review is being upended, as is illustrated here, by online reviews, which are quicker and in many respects have a greater quality. And so I think those are the things we're talking about, not redoing, ending research at think tanks and doing analysis. The question is, how do you disseminate that in a way that engages and reaches a larger audience? Those are the new things that I think we have to think about, and there's specific examples. Brookings trains now every scholar at Brookings has to have a LinkedIn page. It has dramatically increased the utilization of the research at Brookings. That's a reality. Carnegie did away with its journals because of the cost and because they were uncertain who was reading it. They did a strategic marketing analysis, which technology now makes possible, and you can essentially know who's going to read it. Netflix does it. You read X, we think you're going to read Y. That's what think tanks can do. If you read this piece, you're more likely to do that. That's the stuff we're talking about, not dumbing down everything we do. I think that's, or not producing books. The challenge is we have to produce books and journals and all of the other stuff. That's the real challenge.
The limited point I wanted to make was that I think the contexts are slightly different. You know, comparing the Western context with the Indian context has a bit of a problem because we are still struggling in this country, in our universities, in making sure that students do fundamental research. That is our problem. So therefore, now the challenge is, if you immediately move to the next stage where we are saying, now look, think of the medium, then I think there is a real issue here in terms of generating good basic research which can be disseminated. And I think that's a real problem for us in terms of education standards.
I'll just come there for a second, and sorry to jump the queue here, but I see all these panels happening, especially in internet policy. There's not one PhD there. So you have this inherent fragility in the research framework in terms of the kind of support they have. And then you have this layer of communication which becomes too powerful, right? And then your existing funding allocation organizational priorities shift alongside that. So I know what's your concern here, but I would say that do we have that environment itself which supports good research scholars to stay in India and conduct long-term research? And that's a question which is, I think, a little bit separate. Now, secondly, are young people incentivized to do long-form research, devote years of their life? I think they are, even in the advocacy sector. There are so many young people who come to me and they say, yes, I'll do only this amount of time I can give to advocacy. The rest I will devote to possibly writing up this peer-reviewed article which I need to send for submission here and there. And you know, there's a very telling phrase from this book called The Cult of the Amateur, which was published in 2007 by Andrew Keen. I don't like his general writing, but he said that basically, if you have 10,000 monkeys typing on a keyboard, 1 million strokes, they won't come up with the works of Shakespeare. But then I may also ask how many people read the works of Shakespeare. But then how many people who do read the works of Shakespeare go on to write more fiction? So there is value to this work. People do understand it. And I think there's also an informal gatekeeping role of older scholars who still play that role in India, who do produce these books. There's so many books which are coming out now on legal writing now. There's one by Rohit Day which will be released on 11th. And I think the community is growing. It needs that support, and I think communication can help that here. I really think the best engagement I personally get on Twitter is when I put up a small paragraph from this book I read, or this is how it relates, and people go out and buy it. They ask for the Amazon link. So things are not that dark and gloomy. Also, one final thing just to end this, research has recently shown that people are watching not those short 10-second YouTube videos, but the longer 7 to 10-minute ones. Podcasts by itself are consumed over a longer term of time, and people go back. And if you link that to your research, that's the proverbial hook to the bait, and your bait is essentially this podcast or the YouTube video, and people do end up going into the research. And it's very important to our work.
Professor Pant, if I may, you have very exacting standards, and we're all aware of that. But I think that when you say that, are we in the business of research? We are in the business of ideas. We're pushing the envelope in terms of research. I understand that your point about, specialists and the fundamentals of research being very shaky in our country are all right, and they're all very relevant. But I think in terms of youngsters being incentivized, even an organization like mine, which is so traditional and closed, there are young people wanting to get their name published on the website or getting published in a journal after they've gone on, perhaps being completely unsalaried, want to join senior researchers on sort of field trips and go gather information and come just so that they get the stamp of being published in a peer-reviewed journal. So while I completely understand the point you're making, I think we can't, as he said, it may not be as dark and gloomy as you.
No, I'm not saying it is at all dark and gloomy. I'm just saying that I think what is happening is that the rest of the world is catching up faster than we imagine. And I think this is going to be an area where I think our policymakers will have to focus really, really hard. Because see, 10 years back, I remember when university rankings used to come, China was nowhere.
That's right.
Today, Chinese universities are in the top 50 in massive ways. They have invested, they have created ecosystems, and I think we are lagging behind in that discussion. So I think a think tank, the world of think tanks can exist and can prosper only if we have a larger sort of an ecosystem from where we are bringing in youngsters, we are bringing in scholars who are shaping the scholarship, which we can take forward as in our way in terms of policy. Right, and I think Apar's point is well taken. There are certain areas where we have done well. Legal areas, I'm sorry, I'm still very pessimistic about social sciences in India. It still remains a domain where we are doing very, very poorly compared to global standards. And I think the challenge today is that our middle classes are voting by their feet. Middle classes are taking their kids to Singapore now for even undergraduate education. So therefore, we will have a problem going forward in terms of who has a stake in this education system. And if we don't build that up, then our think tank world will remain very, very constricted and restricted, I'm afraid. So the conversations ultimately will have to be about education. Whether we are looking at innovation in healthcare, whether we are talking of foreign policy, unless we get this bit right, I'm afraid all the other bits will get more complicated going forward.
Thank you. I think we could use the conversations that we have had today to build on how we can use our platforms to gather that expertise and encourage the think tank community to think more in those terms. I'm going to invite any last comments that you'd like to make before we wrap up for the next session.
Well, I think we had a very interesting conversation and discussion about the rigor of research. What we do at Mantraya is when we recruit the researchers, we ask them to identify a topic of their choice, and thereby they do their survey of literature before they begin any project, and they work on a long-term project. And therein we also make them responsible for what they're writing. So I think with rigor comes responsibility, and a way of outreach is through the social media, either through Facebook or Twitter, and they do get a feedback. So we create that stardom at the later stage. We try to inculcate a basic of fundamentals of research, and thereby take on to different platforms to get a kind of feedback, not just the stardom which we have been talking about. I agree with Professor Jim in terms of the research products. I think books are important, but also the research products which are more relevant to today's age and time. I think the point about the digital highway is highly relevant, but the fact is just to get on the highway, you don't forget everything. You have to first learn how to drive. So that is the fundamentals of research. If you don't know how to drive, you get there and then you're lost on the highway. So we don't want that kind of situation to develop in India. So that's what my concern is. Pardon me?
But hit others as well.
Sure.
It happens because something just goes on and...
So, and the last point is about the whole idea of having specialized research. I think I'd still emphasize on that because that's where the young can make a lot of impact, and then they could use platforms as you are talking about of linking their work to the larger audience. And therein comes the credibility for their work, and they also get an audience and they get opportunities to work on this subject. So I think that's a long-term strategy. And in talking in strategic communication terms, I think there's various forms of engagement, which we have really not talked about. So maybe you can have one more conference just looking at strategic communication of engagement at this level, because I think it's a time to do it now. Let's stop there. Thank you.
All right, I think thank you very much all of you for your active feedback and contribution. I think let's be positive about this conversation and say that we still have, let's tweet about it after this, and say that we're on the communication highway. We're being very careful and we're taking the learner's license as if now. But so it's been great. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And thank you.